sailing through the underworld to reappear each and every morning in the east, aboard the ship of daytime. Both the sun and the dead man have been vivified by their journey to the heart of darkness. All this is beautifully rendered inside the tomb of Ramses VI. The great book of the sacred words of immortality is kept by Osiris, king of the dead. Osiris has been murdered by his brother Seth. Later, the mummified Osiris was the first god to rise from the dead. Close to him stands Anubis, the jackal god of embalmment, the very one who performed the mummification process upon the body of Osiris. Sheltered by the natural pyramid that dominates the Valley of the Kings, 58 pharaohs are here lying in their graves. They range from the 18th dynasty to the 20th dynasty. The whole life story of Seti I, whose mummified face remains beautifully preserved, is related inside his grave, which is a real symphony of colors. The stone steps lead us a long way underground to the funeral chamber. There, once the last of the living have left, a whole world depicted on the walls comes to life. The whole people of Egypt were fascinated beyond words by their belief in immortality. Here, at the beginning of the 20th century, a capital discovery upon pharaonic civilization was made. A great number of precious objects were found inside the grave of Tutankhamun. He had been resting for 35 centuries in his golden sarcophagus. His mummy bears testimony of a very sharp blow which caused a facial wound that never could heal. His body has been encased in 3 man-shaped coffins. The first coffin, made of solid gold, was set inside a wood one covered with gold leaves and inlaid with turquoise, cornelian, and lapis lazuli. The second coffin rested inside a third casement, overlaid with thick gold leaves. The king's viscera were carefully kept inside this same chapel, watched over by 4 goddesses of eternal sleep: Selkit, Isis, Nephthys, Night. This site was discovered by the British archaeologist Howard Carter in 1922. Thanks to him, daylight sprang again inside this chamber. All the funeral apparatus, bed, jewels, statues, alabaster, figurines, all this wonderful treasure which had been spared by time and plunder appeared in perfect condition. Thanks to very minute tests performed on the seeds found inside the grave, it is possible to say that the young pharaoh met his death in the month of January 1342 BC. He was barely 19 at the time. He still looks remarkably alive after 3,500 years of untroubled sleep. Tutankhamun made Thebes the capital city of Egypt again. He also reintroduced the cult of the ancient gods. Why all this gold on the young pharaoh's body? Why this scabbard beetle, a symbol of the rising sun's rebirth after the long journey through darkness? In the 60s, scientists found evidence that the wound on the face of the young pharaoh was a murderous stroke. So the god, Anubis, was keeping watch over the victim of an assassination. Tutankhamun was a handsome boy, and his child wife, Ankhsenamun, looked on him with loving care. While the gentle lioness of the desert weep, from the very heart of the Valley of the Kings, this frail face will stare at the living with its stone eyes till the end of time. The Theban Necropolis, on the left bank of the Nile, is the site of the so-called Temples of a Million Years. Here, beautifully situated inside a great nook of the Libyan cliff, stands the funerary temple of Queen Hatshepsut, daughter of Titmus I and widow of Titmus II. The place is called Der el-Bari, which means the Northern Monastery. From certain angles, it is impossible to tell where the mountain ends and where the temple begins. Both seem to merge into each other. It demonstrates the deliberate use of the rocky setting. A part of the mountain has been tamed. This monument, which people of old used to call most sublime, unfolds its many terraces in the very heart of the Theban Necropolis. On the walls, the great queen's sculptures have recounted in a long and coloured fresco the various events of the expedition into the country of Punt, today's Somalia. It had not been a military adventure, but merely a peaceful expedition. In a paradoxical way, the paintings are as good as new, but there cannot be found a single unscathed portrait of the Queen Hatshepsut herself. It so happened that a successor, Titmus III, whom she had previously banned from power, ordered all representations of her to be defaced as a post-mortemus revenge. That is the reason why we can't absolutely be certain that this mummy is really hers. The wise Queen Hatshepsut reigned for 22 years. She was a great monarch, and going along with her people's wishes, she had called herself a man and pretended to be king. The Memnon Colossus are two statues in the effigy of Amenophis III. These statues used to guard the entrance of the latter's funerary temple, which has today disappeared. There are very few remaining stones of this other Temple of a Million Years. That of Ramses II, the Ramesseum, it was probably torn apart and its pieces scattered during some earthquake. When it was standing in one piece, the Ramesseum used to have a rather sturdy and heavy appearance. But today's jumble of ruins and pillars tells with acute vividness the glory of Pharaoh. It speaks of his great military deeds against the Hittites, and most of all, the Battle of Kadesh, 13 centuries before Christ. Today, the mummified Pharaoh is in such a perfect state that it nearly turns his life and deeds into contemporary history. A little way from Ramses II's funerary temple in Medinet Habu, Pharaoh Ramses III, who founded the 20th dynasty, had his own royal palace and funerary temple erected. All the important apartments of the main floor can be identified inside the royal temple. The audience room, when the foundations of the steps leading to the throne can be seen, the bathroom, and other facilities. The funerary temple is like a gigantic book, illustrated and carved in stone in a very vivid and often cruel way, quite in contrast with the usual serenity of Egyptian art. Ramses III is the ultimate Ramesside, who will fight to safeguard the independence of the Egyptian kingdom against foreign intruders. This is why war is represented here in a very realistic manner. The sad fate of the enemies of Egypt is depicted so that none shall ignore in future times that they met a bloody death. Corpses are stacked in heaps. As for the survivors, they are led into captivity, and the king Ramses III is branding their chief with a hot iron. In fact, this is the end of a blessed time, for Egypt is going to sink into dependence for thousands of years to come. Persian, Greek, Roman armies will invade the country in turns. This makes the Temple of Medina Abu the last of the great monuments of a purely Egyptian period. There were festivals and holidays as well. The representations of the god Amun's journey from Karnak to Medinet Abu, or the pharaoh wearing his blue crown and hunting a wild bull, all scenes are depicted with great vivacity. Here is Pharaoh in the heat of a wild pursuit. He is standing on the prow of his light cart, wielding his bow and aiming his spear at a desperate animal whose great body is collapsing in the reeds. The lightly colored stone of Medinet Abu, upon which light and shadow are playing with extreme gentleness, bears an inscription on one of its engravings, the word Kermet. Kermet used to be the name by which the Egyptian people named their own land. Now we're inside the Valley of the Queens, the southern part of the Theban Necropolis. It used to be called the Place of Beauty, where the wives and daughters of the kings would be buried as well as the young princes of the Ramessides of royal blood. Inside the grave of Hamin-er-Kopchef, son of Ramses III, a small fetus is laid. These tiny skeletons found in the royal tomb could be symbols of resurrection. Between Aswan and the Sudanian border stretches the land of Egyptian Nubia, whose sands have preserved the temples of Abu Simbel. 200 years ago, the great temple of Ramses II was discovered by chance. In 1964, the whole architectural structure was cut into blocks and rebuilt 64 meters higher, just before ancient Nubia was flooded forever. Horakti, the local deity, was then set against its seat between two of the gigantic statues. All the splendors of Abu Simbel shows the imprint of the great Ramses. Whereas his forefathers had been building temples high as mountains, Ramses cut into mountains to model them in the shape of his own image. Towering 25 meters above ground, the four-faced king is gazing forever at its southern border, where the Nile flows out of the blue into the kingdom of the crowned deities. To enter the temple, one has to walk along a hall with pillars supporting statues of King Ramses II, in the guise of Osiris, arms folded across the chest, holding the scepter and the whip. Twice a year, the sun darts to the very heart of the sanctuary like a silver sword arousing slumbering deities. Here sit Ta, Amun, the godly Ramses, and Horakti, waiting for human visitors till the end of time. The face of the king shows that kind of knowledge that belongs solely to the gods. In a nearby place, the king had a smaller sanctuary built, dedicated to the goddess Hathor. But in fact, it's a tribute to his own queen and wife, Nefertari, whose image is displayed on the outer walls. Nefertari's name means the beauty who belongs to him. Her naked body surges from the stony cliff, left foot set in a forward motion. The pharaohs, close to the gods, were still men, celebrating through their sculptures their beliefs and their love. The whole civilization and history of Egypt belongs to the river. Men have managed to turn the yearly flood into a beneficial event in their lives. The Egyptian people knew from the start that their lives depended on the river, so they measured with great exactitude the rhythms of the godly flow. The first day of the flood marked the beginning of a new year. 1 year was divided into 3 seasons of 4 months each of 30 days. Water has always been raised with the shaduf, a counterbalance bucket, or the saki, which requires the slow pace of an ox going round and round to fill the jugs. Much later, these canals were dug to irrigate the land. The Theban Necropolis is still holding back some of its secrets. In a narrow vale south of the Valley of the Kings lies Deir el-Medinet, a dead city where painters and carvers used to live. These workers used to decorate rolled tombs. These men would, in their spare time, build and decorate their own graves with an entrance in a pyramidal form. These creators, as Senejan, unbridled their imaginations by reinterpreting for themselves the themes they worked on when on duty. They made a very free and personal use of the sacred rules they applied elsewhere. With colorful mastery, they recreated during the New Kingdom scenes of daily life tinged with the zest of humor. They depict with wonderful realism and poetry the lives of herons, foxes, cicada, deers, bulls, as well as the busy existence of fishermen and hunters. All these scenes are a delight. Egyptian painting is the richest and most valuable body of paintings that antiquity has bequeathed on us. The scenes showing the various labors of the fields are quite unchanged through the centuries. It is a pleasure to realize that women are central in this celebration of life. Upon the delicately made-up lips of these women, free and happy, we can still read the words, complacent and indiscreet, that papyri are carrying to our ears. I am your first sister. You are the garden I have sworn with flowers and balsam trees. Your voice makes me dizzy, and my life is in the grace of your voice. Your presence is dearer to me than either food or water. When I hold her in my arms, methinks I am the land, and that the land is scented with incense. Could I only be the slave who takes care of her, then I could delight in the sight of her beauty. A queen among living women, Nefertari gives us the impression that she is still inside her grave. Her grave is an explosion of bright colors at the very heart of the Valley of the Queens. But in this land of Egypt, the real miracle is for the visitor, to see the paintings he has just admired below ground come to life around him under the sun. Here, nothing has changed much. The Ptolemies are the new kings who have come from Greece. They have worshipped the ancient gods of Egypt. They have dedicated new temples to their glory. The Temple of Horus in Edfu, a traditional Egyptian building, was built by these Greek sovereigns. Here we can see the facade of the great hypostyle hall, showing interconnected columns in the middle and bearing the Edfu triad. This is the main gate surmounted by the winged disc. The whole building still seems to be teeming with life under the severe gaze of Horus, keeping an everlasting watch. Here we can see the inner yard with its large porticos, 32 columns each, displaying a choice of floral adornments. Now is the very heart of the shrine, the naos, topped by a small pyramid. It used to shelter the statue of the Godhead, which would sometimes be carried around in this light rowing boat. Along these galleries, warding off oblivion under the clear sky, every single episode of the victory festivals have been represented like some magnificent picture book. Among other great festivals celebrated in Edfu, the annual selection of a new falcon stood in pride of place. This bird was supposed to incarnate the god Horus and give evidence to the renewal of the god's sovereignty. This felucca is leading us towards Esna, north of Edfu. These wooden boats are a sign that Esna is near, and here we are going to meet a people who still live in the world of their forefathers. In fact, the people in Esna have always voluntarily refused what so-called civilization could offer them. This is why their daily life unfolds in the vicinity of this shrine, and that their own ancestors used to worship. The building lacks the grace and stylization of the Pharaonic period. Still, the columns do recall the shape of the great delta of the Nile in blossoming floral patterns. Towering above the languid curves of the river, built in a cluster of palm trees, here is the temple of Komombu, fast asleep under the noon sky. The great slumbering crocodile worshipped here, the god Sobek, along with the falcon-headed god Haru Aris. Both these divinities are endlessly portrayed upon the columns of the temple, among a variety of signs and sketches of an often surrealistic design. Komombu used to be a city of garrison, and the soldiers were builders as well. As amazing as it might seem, local councils had the possibility to launch such a vast program of construction. The state did not interfere in such matters. That is why we can learn in Komombu everything about the men who still build temples and the Ptolemies. In Komombu, as in every temple in the most recent Egyptian period, there's a great abundance of texts, carved or